Photo editing is a crucial part to my photography process, and just like many other elements and aspects of photography, the way that I approach it is always changing. And recently, I've been getting a lot of questions about how I achieve the look of my photos, whether you believe that I have a certain look or not. But in today's video, I'm going to take 4 photos and I'm going to edit them from scratch to give you as much insight into my process as possible. Now, just a quick disclaimer, for the most part, I do use my presets to edit my photos, both from my MSF1 preset pack that is on my website, and more recently a few new ones that I've created over the last couple months. But for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to use the presets on the photos that I edit. Now, it should go without saying that the way I edit my photos is not necessarily the right way, and there is no right way of editing your photos because it's all subjective in the end. I just kind of want to show you my process and hope you can take something out of it. So here are the 4 raw photos that I'm going to edit. And if I could give you one piece of advice, it's to not try to copy these exact settings on your photos because, you might be using a totally different camera and sensor, and you might expose your photos differently, and you just won't have the same image, so you won't exactly get the same results. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's jump into Lightroom. Okay, so this photo was taken in March of this year. It was shot on the Sony a7 IV with the Tamron 28-75 f2.8 at 40mm. Okay, so right off the bat, I can tell that this composition is basically exactly what I want in my final image, so I won't really need to do much in terms of cropping. However, the first thing that I do with every single photo is I go to the lens corrections tab and I remove chromatic aberration and I enable profile corrections. For this one, I'll also go to the transform section right under it and I will click the auto upright just to straighten things out a bit. So when you look at this raw file, it seems to lean a little bit more into the bluish tones, but from what I remember shooting this photo, it was very warm because of that gold light filtering in. So what I'm going to do is go to the basic section and I'm just going to warm this photo up before I really do anything else. So I think right around here should do the trick. So that gives us a good base to start editing all your exposure and contrast settings. This raw file is a little bit dark as well. So what I'm going to do is boost the exposure right around there. And I'm also going to bring down the contrast just a bit to give it a little bit of more of a soft feel, I guess. So there's no blown out highlights in this photo, so what I'll do with the highlights is just keep them where they are. We could always come back to them later if we want to, but I'm going to keep them at 0. For the shadows, I am going to bring them up just a little bit because I will make the shadow images of the shadow parts of the image darker in a different way, but for now we're going to bring up the shadows. We're going to bring up the whites just a little bit as well, and then what I'll do is, and what I typically do with almost all my photos, is drop the black. So I think I'll go right around there. So for the presence section, I don't go too crazy, but I do like to add a little bit of like texture, I guess, and that's exactly what it's called. So we're gonna put that up to around 10. I'm gonna drop the clarity because we don't love a ton of clarity. And for my dehaze, I'm just gonna bring that down a little bit and notice how the whole image changes, kind of like the tones got a little bit warmer. And that's something that you have to be careful with when you play around with the dehaze slider if you want to keep a certain, color tone throughout your image. Okay, so the last thing I'll do in this section is just bring up the vibrance just a little bit. And this is already a really good base for the image. Honestly, I wouldn't really have to do a ton more, but for the sake of this video, we're gonna keep going. So we're gonna close that section. We're gonna go down to the tone curves, which are probably the most important section when it comes to my photos. For the parametric curve, we're gonna skip it. You could always come back to it later, like I said, but we're gonna go straight to the tone curve. So for this image, I'm gonna go with a pretty standard S curve. So I'll just drop this a little bit, go up in the midtones, go a little bit up in the highlights, and then bring this a little bit down. And we can also kind of give it a little bit of a fade and then drop the shadows a bit more. Okay, so for the red channel, I typically like to have a cooler undertone in my images, so mainly in the shadows. And already for this image, I know that I'm not gonna have to do a lot when it comes to the curves because I like the warmth I got from just going into the basic corrections. But what I will do a little bit is just kind of drag this into the cyan. So the shadow's there. I don't know why my mouse is doing that thing. You guys see it? It's like, it's still doing it. Okay, whatever. So I'm just gonna drop everything a little bit into the cyan region, just like that. Okay, so we're gonna move into the green channel. Typically, when you're shooting film and you underexpose your images, you will see that the shadows kind of have this like greenish grain. And if you're trying to emulate a film stock in your digital photos, that's something that you should kind of, I guess, be mindful of. So if you want to do that, all you have to do is kind of lift these shadows into the green a little bit, and then I'll drop the midtones and the highlights down to a little bit more magenta. Okay, just like that. Okay, so now on to the blue channel. Honestly, like I already like this image as it is, but I do, like I said, I do like to have a cooler undertone in my images, so I'm gonna lift kind of the shadows into the blues and then bring down everything else towards the warmer areas. Okay, so that's enough for the tone curve. Now what we'll do is go into the color mixer, and honestly, I don't really need to touch anything here, but what I will do is go to the oranges and just drop the luminance down ever so slightly. There we go. Did that change anything? Very, very little. Okay, so onto the color mixer. I used to play around in this section a lot more, but not so much recently, and I really only do it when I want to adjust or emphasize a very specific color within the photo. So in this one, we have some orange in the woman's hair, as well as red in the Coca-Cola sign, the street sign, and the wall where it says Biggie's Bodega. But I'm actually gonna leave the red and orange alone, and I'm just gonna go to the yellow and slightly shift the luminance, if you can see. I don't want it to be too green, so I'm gonna shift it a little bit more into the orange side. For the color mixer, I think that's all we're gonna do. And we're gonna move on to the color grading section. So I'm gonna go to the shadows circle, and I'm just gonna drop it kind of down into this bluish area. And if you ever wanna check what your last adjustment did, you can just click on the eye right here. So it doesn't do much, but I can tell, especially when I look at it several times. And then for the rest of the image, I just want to warm it up a tad bit, so I'm going to go a little bit warmer in the midtones and a little bit warmer right here in the highlights. Lastly, all I'm going to do is add a little bit of grain in the effects section. So I'm going to bring it up to about 35, which is where I like to have it. Same thing for the size. And yeah, this is the final image. This is one of those photos that didn't need a ton of adjustment when it came to the colors because I did most of the heavy lifting in the basic section. Okay, so I took this photo on a rainy night out shooting that I actually made a video of, which you can check out right here. And it was shot on the Sony a7 IV with the Sigma 85mm f1.4. As you can tell, this raw file doesn't have a ton of color in it to begin with, so I could probably push it in a few different ways, but for this one, I think we're gonna go in that bluish, greenish, cine route. But before we do that, I do wanna make sure that the silhouette of the person in the steam is in the center of the image to make it the main focus of the photo. So what I'm gonna do is go to the crop tool, and we're just gonna kind of drag it so that way the person is right in the middle of the frame. We're gonna lift it up a little bit, and then this is what we're gonna roll with. Right after that, we'll go back to the lens corrections. We will enable profile corrections, which was already ticked off. We'll remove chromatic aberration, and we can go to the transform tool and just hit auto to see what it'll look like. But for this one, it looks like it kind of makes it a little crooked, so we're just gonna keep it off. Okay, so now we're back to the top in the basic section, and I'm not going to really touch much of the exposure to begin with, but what I will do is add a little bit of contrast right there. I don't want the highlights to be too overbearing, so I'm going to drop them a little bit, kind of maybe around right there. I'm also going to drop the shadows because we want the focus of the image in that center. We don't really care about all the exterior buildings that are in the back and on the outside of the frame. So we're just going to drop the shadows a little bit right around there. I'm going to keep the white where it is, and then I will go down to the black slider and just bring it down. Let's see, maybe right around -25. Looks about good. This time I will adjust the presence section a bit more. So I'm going to go to my texture. I'm going to add maybe 15. I'm going to drop the clarity as I typically do. And for the dehaze in this image, as you can tell when I slide it over, it really does a lot with this image. And we want the silhouette to kind of pop a little bit more. So I'm just going to kind of raise the dehaze up to maybe +15, right around there. Looks pretty good. For the vibrance, I'm just going to leave it because I don't really love how that looks if you kind of push it too much. But if I want to adjust any of the saturation levels, I can do that in the color mixer. So we're just going to leave it at 0. Okay, so once again, I'm going to skip the parametric curve and we'll go straight to the point curve. And the tone curve section of this image is really where this photo is going to be brought to life. So first of all, we have this like softness of the steam. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lift this up a little bit to keep that, and I'm going to drop the shadows or the blacks, and then I'm just going to lift the midtones a little bit, lift this up a little bit, and I'm going to drop this. So basically another S-curve. Now I didn't do this in the previous photo, but I typically always start with the blue channel because I feel like I can get my images pretty close to what I want them to look like just by starting off in this channel. So what I'm going to do is, because I want this photo to be more blue, I'm going to basically lift the entire channel into that bluish region. So shadows will go right around there. We're going to go like this. And yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the green channel and I'll do a little bit of playing around, but I also want to incorporate a little bit of those greens into the image. So let's play around here. I'm going to go a bit green in the shadows and then bring kind of everything a little bit more into the magenta regions. So if you just toggle the tone curve on and off, it makes a pretty big difference. So now for the shadows, I'm going to take them into that cyan region right around here. And I don't want to touch too much of the red, but I'm going to bring it back just a little bit because we do have a little bit of red tones in that traffic signal. So right around there is what we're going to do. Okay, so once again, I got most of the color done in the basic and tone curve section, so I don't really need to touch anything in the color mixer. Like I said, you can always come back to it if, there's no specific order of how you should be doing things. For the sake of this video, I am going in order, just to kind of show you the adjustments I make, but I typically make them like out of place and I always come back to certain things. So we're gonna skip the color mixer and we're gonna go straight to the color grading section. So this photo isn't as blue as I want it to be just yet, so I'm gonna go to the shadows and really kind of drop it into that blue region, maybe like right around there. And then for the midtones, I do want a little bit of green, so I'm just gonna kind of take that, bring it up here, and for the highlights, we're gonna warm them up a little bit, so we'll go just like that. Okay, so this is what I have so far, but I'm not exactly too happy with it just yet. So I'm gonna go back to the tone curve and play around just a little bit more, just to get a little bit more green in the image. Or actually what I'll do is I'll drop the shadows into more of the magenta region, but I'll bring up the green in the other areas. So just like that. just like this a little bit. So I basically flipped the green channel from what I had before, and I also want to kind of darken the outside of the image, so I'm just going to go back to my basics. And you can do this with like a radial mask, but I don't typically use masks. So I'm just going to drop the shadows a little bit more, drop the black a little bit more, and that is a lot closer to what I was envisioning. And lastly, I'll just go to my effects, and like for 90% of my images, we're going to bring some grain into it to break up some of that digital sharpness. And here is the final image. So I could have gone a few different routes with this photo, but I like the way it came out here. I think night photos, typically when people see them, you know, they think of like bluish or cooler tones, and I like to, I guess, add a little bit of that cyberpunk look in those greens and magentas. So yeah, this is what we ended up with. So this photo was taken in Williamsburg on the A7 IV with the TT Artisan 75mm f2 lens. So we'll start by, once again, going into the remove chromatic aberration, and this lens doesn't have any profile corrections in Lightroom, so we don't have to take that off. Right here it just says none, so we'll just keep that unchecked. And then we'll go into the transform and see if we click auto. It does straighten out the image a little bit, so we're gonna roll with that. Okay, so now we're in the crop tool, and what I don't like about this image and what I didn't like about it initially is that there's too much going on, and the cars are a very big distraction in the image. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna crop in to make sure that this man is the focal point of the photo. And I'll start by just basically dragging this down, going up like this. I'm just gonna kind of drag this over here a little bit. Maybe make it a little bit bigger. And yeah, that's pretty good right there. Okay, so just by looking at this image, it already looks really good. Honestly, I know I'm gonna want to enhance that color contrast with the red, the green, and those really dark shadows. So I'm gonna go into my basics section, and what I'll do is I'm not gonna touch the exposure just now, but I'm gonna add some contrast into the image. I'm gonna bring some highlights in, drop those shadows, lift the white, and then drop the black just like that. And with this, I can go back to the exposure and adjust accordingly. So I think I'm gonna bring it up just a little bit, right around there. For the texture, because this is such a cropped in shot, I'm gonna run with that. So I'm gonna add more texture into it. I'm gonna bring up the dehaze just a tad. And then if I look at the clarity, see what it does there, I'm just gonna drop it back just a little bit. Okay, so also, before I leave, I'm gonna go into the vibrance and just bring it up to 10, right there. Okay, so let's go down to the tone curve now. For the parametric curve, I'm gonna see what everything does, because I do want a little bit more contrast in this image. So I'm gonna bring up the highlights just a little bit, and as well as the white. I'm gonna leave the darks at 0 as well. Okay, so now on to the point curve. What I wanna do is give this photo a little bit of that crushed black look. So I'm gonna lift this up, but I'm gonna drop this down over here, and then kind of come up in some of the other regions. So once again, a bit of a S-curve, which is pretty standard in my photos. And then I'm gonna go to the blue channel. I do like that cooler undertone, so we're gonna lift the shadows into the blues a little bit, and then play around with this. I think I'll keep it fairly similar to the default setting, and then yeah, keep that right there. Now we'll move into the green channel. See, this does a lot because the prominent color in the photo is that reddish orange. So if I take it to magenta, it's gonna look a lot more red. But if I bring it to the green, it's gonna go more orange. So I do want it to go a little bit orange because That's kind of what I remember the wall to look like. So we're just gonna keep that right there. And then with the shadows, we're gonna drop them a little bit into the magenta. And then I'm not really gonna touch too much of the highlights. For the red channel, let's play around with this. I don't love how it looks when you kind of adjust this, so I'm just gonna keep it kind of pretty default. So let's go to the color mixer. So what I'm gonna do is I want that wall to be really striking. Even though it already is pretty good, I'm gonna go to my oranges and just kind of maybe bring up the saturation a little bit and play around with the illuminance. So I'll do that. Go back to my reds, and I think I'll keep that where it is. And for the blues, as you can see, if I remove the saturation completely, the door becomes, you know, more white, but I kind of did like those blue shadows, so I'm gonna leave it right around there. Okay, so we're gonna go to the color grading and we're gonna drop the shadows into that blue area. We're gonna go to our midtones and bring out a little bit more of those warmer tones. And the highlights, obviously, if you just play around with this, you can really see how it affects the image. But I think I'm just gonna keep it in the yellows for now. And this is basically 99% of the final image, but what I'll do is go back down to the effects. So I'm just gonna introduce some grain, go 30 and 30. And yeah, this is the final image. It's a little bit different from what you may have seen on my Instagram because my tastes always fluctuate in the way I edit, and and yeah, let's move on to the fourth and final image. This was shot back in October on the A7 IV and the Samyang 35mm f1.8. The first thing, obviously, that I'm gonna do is go to my lens corrections, enable profile corrections, remove chromatic aberration, and then go down to transform and select auto, which straightens this image out just a little bit, so we're gonna keep it right there. Okay, so now we're gonna go into cropping this photo. There's a little bit too much negative space in this image, especially on the right side of the frame. So what I'm gonna do is kind of crop in like this, and I don't need this whole bottom part of the image, so I'm just gonna kind of slide it up right here, include some of that sky, and yeah, it effectively cuts out that crowd in the top right corner. And if I go like this is pretty close to what I like. So we're gonna roll with this crop. This image is exposed pretty nicely. So, when it comes to an image that's already exposed like this, you don't really have to do a ton of work, but let's play around with it and see what I like. I really want this image to pop because you have those men wearing the darker suits and the women wearing these grayish blue attire. I don't know what to call it. I don't want to call it the wrong thing. I like the highlights where they are. For some reason, when I shot this photo, it was like the softest white ever. It was insane. I feel like I could only get that in editing, but somehow it just happened on the scene. So we're gonna drop the shadows a little bit, right around there. If I lift up the highlights, I'm actually gonna drop the whites down, 15, and then I'm gonna drop the black a little bit. Okay, so I'm not gonna touch the presence too much on this image because I like the structure of the image. I don't know if that's the correct term, but whatever. And I'm gonna add a little bit of vibrance. Okay, so I like shooting CineStill 800T during the day, because it's a tungsten balanced film. It has this like blue wash on the photos when you shoot them in the daylight. So I think that's kind of what I want to go with in this one, instead of taking it monochrome or even taking it into like more of a warmer look. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to touch the parametric curve, but I will come to the point curve. I'm going to keep this where it is. I'm going to drop the shadows a little bit. I'll actually leave the midtones a little bit under what they were originally. I'll bring this up a little bit and then drop this down. So this is a little bit less of a dramatic S-curve than the previous images. And then I'll go to my blue channel, and I'm just gonna lift this up right around there. For the shadows, I will kind of lift those just a little bit slightly up, and then I'm actually gonna bring the highlights down a little bit into that yellow region. Okay, so moving over to the green channel, we're gonna go a little bit into this bluish section, the green section, and then we're gonna play around here. Pretty default. And then we're gonna lift the highlights into that green region right there. All right, lastly, the red channel. I want that bluish look, so I'm gonna kind of drop it into the cyan. I like it right there. And then for the highlights, we're gonna kind of keep it in the cyan region. All right, so if I turn this off and turn it on, this is what we got. So now we're gonna go down to our color mixer. There's no, saturation or hue change that I wanna make to this image. I think what I will do is I'll go to my blues and I'm gonna kind of push them a little bit more into the teal. So I'll just go like -10. And then I'm also gonna drop the luminance just a little bit right around there. Okay, so then I'll go down to my color grading and let's see what happens when, you play around with this. I think once again, I'm gonna go into the blue for the shadows. I don't wanna go too crazy either. So for the midtones, we'll also bring that down into the blue. And for the highlights, gonna kind of go maybe a little bit into the greenish yellows right around there. So now I'm gonna go down to my effects, add some grain to this image. I think one thing I want to adjust a little bit more is the tone curve. So I'll go to the green channel. I want to introduce a little bit more green. So I'll just keep that here. But in the midtones, I'll kind of push it up just a little bit. And then that can stay basically where it was. Okay, so this is our final image. It's a little bit different from what I originally had it as, and I'll kind of show you right now. This is one of the first edits that I did using that freeze preset, but if I just go back to what it looks like now, it's a little bit more green, and obviously things will shift. If I edited this photo 10 times, I'm sure I would get like 8 different looks probably. So here are the before versions of the photos. And here are the edits that I made. That is the end of this video. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more insight as to how I edit my photos and how you can kind of implement certain techniques into your own work. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know I'm really bad at explaining things while I do them because it's not natural. I don't talk while I edit. If you want to buy my MSF1 preset pack, like I said, I'll leave that link in the description, but yeah. See you in the next one.